Hello world! Welcome to Learning Java, one byte at a time. This is video 18 in a tutorial series geared at bringing the wonderful wide world of Java to those with little or no programming experience. I am super excited about this next project because over the course of the next several videos we're going to be undertaking something quite a bit more sophisticated than we've ever built. We're going to be bringing together all of the concepts we've learned in previous videos as well as introducing several new elements to our programming repertoire. The name of this application is Car Bluebook, and as you can imagine, being a Bluebook, it's going to take a car object that's either going to be created or loaded from a previous creation, have the user prompted to define features and the condition of the car, and then attempt to derive an estimated dollar value of that car object. And so this is going to be a lot of fun, and we have a lot to cover here. Some of the concepts we'll be going over are going to be overloading constructors, which leads us to the idea of constructor chaining. We'll also be designing this using layering architecture, which is a way of keeping the code modular and segregated. We'll be talking about bitwise operators, which is a new concept which we haven't covered yet. We'll also be getting into what's called error handling. And finally, we'll learn how to access, read, and write files. So there's a lot to cover here, so let's go ahead and get started by diving right into our Notepad++ application. So before we actually start on the project, I want you to consider two different class files. We have a class file which creates a box object and a class file which creates a circle object. And as you can imagine, in creating those objects, we're going to need to have three different fields of the box. And the fields are going to be the length, width, and height. And those are going to be defined or declared as integers. And then here in the box constructor, we're going to pass through those integer values as parameters. Then using the this keyword, we're going to assign those integers passed through respectively to the fields of the box, the length, width, and height. Now, imagine that you don't know how big you want the box to be, or even more, imagine that you know that you want to create a cube and that you're only going to need one value. It seems a little redundant to pass through the same value 3 times, or in not knowing how big the box is, to have to create an entirely separate class that creates a box that accepts no parameters. The way that Java solves this is by doing what's called overloading constructors. And the way that you overload a constructor is by calling another constructor of the same name, but with a different signature. And a signature, if you remember, is simply the name of the method and the parameters of the method. And so if you have the same name but different parameters, you have a different signature. And we know that if we're calling a public method of the same name of the class, that it's a constructor. And so if I have a public box with 3 parameters, that will return a box object accepting those 3 parameters. If I have a public box that has 1 parameter, that's going to be an entirely different signature but the same kind of constructor. And then down here you can see I have a public box that accepts no parameters. So, how does Java know which of these constructors to use? Well, that's actually the cool part, in that the class or the user that calls to construct the object will pass through either no parameters or 1 parameter or 3 parameters, and based on how many parameters the user passes through, Java will assign accordingly to the right constructor. And so if our class or user calls to create a box object and gives 3 integers, Java will automatically come to this constructor and use this one to create the box object. If our user knows that they're going to be creating a cube and calls to create a box object with only 1 parameter, Java will then come through and use this constructor and then assign that one single value to all 3 of the dimensions of the box, effectively making a cube. And if we don't know how big the box is going to be, we just want to have a generic box. Down here, we can call the box class, or we can call the box constructor with no parameters, and Java will call this constructor. And let's just say that we're going to assign an arbitrary value of 10 if we don't know how big the box is going to be. And so that's really cool. Now, going over here to the circle class, we have similarly 3 integer values of the fields of the circle, the radius, and then the x and the y axis, which is going to be the location of the circle. Now, again, if we don't know how big the circle is going to be or where it's going to be located, we have here a constructor that accepts no parameters. It will throw back a circle that has an arbitrary value of 0 for the x and the y axis, which is effectively just keeping it centered to the graph, and we'll say that we have an arbitrary value of 10 for the radius of the circle. Likewise, if we know how big the circle is going to be, we have a constructor here that accepts only one parameter, the parameter for the radius. And likewise, it assigns 0 to the x and the y, keeping it centered to the graph. Those are just arbitrary values. But if we know exactly where we want the circle and how big we want it, we can call to create a circle object with 3 parameters, and Java will automatically use this constructor. It will accept the 3 integers, it will assign them to the x and the y axis, as well as the radius of the circle. And so hopefully it's sort of clear how this creates a lot of flexibility and dynamo with creating objects without having to create completely separate object classes. And that's all good and well. However, notice this is also kind of verbose. I mean, we have a lot of redundancies here. And so in overloading these constructors, how could we go a step further and make this even more succinct? The way that this is done is by doing what's called constructor chaining. And so let's assume that we're starting with a circle that has no parameters. We know that we're going to assign arbitrary location and size values of 0, 0, and the size of 10. The way that this is going to be done is much like using the this keyword to access the field of the object that we don't know that we're going to be working with at any time. We can use the this keyword to call its own constructor. And so knowing that it's going to be values of 0, 0, and 10, we can call the constructor within its own constructor. We can pass through the arbitrary value of 10 for the radius. And what this will do is calling a constructor of the circle with one integer or one parameter will chain it up here to this constructor, and it will pass through that value of 10 as the r in this method. Then here it will then assign the 0, and then it will assign this 10 to the radius. But we can go a step further and even call this method one more time with the arbitrary 0 and 0 that we know of and the value r that we're passing through, which, if it's coming from this original constructor, will still be 10. And then this one, being a constructor with 3 values, will chain it one more time up here to this constructor, which actually accepts the 3 values. And so the 0 and 0 will be passed through, respectively, to the x and y. This 10 that gets passed through and reassigned here will again get reassigned up here. And after all said and done, we will still end up with our circle that is centered to the graph. That's with the 0 and the 0 for the x and the y axis, and the 10 for the radius. And so notice how elegant a solution this is for the flexibility of not having to create separate class files and being able to create a circle that we may not know how big it is, but being able to pass on those arbitrary values by chaining the first constructor to the second constructor to the third constructor. Likewise, we can do the same thing with the box object. Now, assuming that we don't know how big the box is going to be, but we know that in that case we'll just assign it an arbitrary value of 10, we'll call the this constructor keyword to pass through the value of 10, which in turn calls this constructor, passes through the 10 here, and furthermore we can call that this constructor one more time and pass through that value 3 times. That's going to be a 10, which will in turn call this constructor, because now we have a constructor that's passing through 3 parameters. So the 10 gets assigned here, called to this constructor, which will chain it up to this one that accepts 1 parameter. It will then take that same value of 10, call the constructor that it intakes 3 parameters, pass through that 10 3 times, which will chain it up here to this parameter. And then when that 10 gets passed through as the parameters to this method, it will then accordingly get assigned to each one of those 3. And so hopefully it's really clear how cool and elegant a solution this is, and how it keeps the dynamo of the program and the flexibility of the program there, so that you're not having to be redundant and you're not having to create separate class files. Now, that was quite a lot for one video. I do want to get into the project, but I don't want to make this video too long, and so hopefully that was something that you can sort of simmer on and kind of toy around with. Otherwise, we're going to be back very soon to go ahead and start this project with the constructor overloading and constructor chaining of the car object, the car class that we're going to be starting in the next video. But that's about enough for one video. I hope this was informative and enjoyable, and I look forward to seeing everyone back again in the next video. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night.